Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this topic, we will be talking about taxes and subsidies. This is the first very meaty topic that we get into, and it stays meaty from that point on. You'll find that a lot of these topics take anywhere from perhaps 3 to 6 videos now to complete instead of just one or two. Now, the last topic we had been talking about, price controls and central planning, dealt with a question of what happens when the government intervenes to impose a non-equilibrium price, either through a price ceiling or a price floor. We discussed briefly, when I say we, I mean as if you were in the classroom with me. We discussed briefly central planning and the contrast between how a command economy, like a modern day communist state, would handle this problem, and how a market economy handles that problem. And we also talked a bit about Adam Smith, the founder of economics, and how his unique perspective on this, his unique approach, laid the foundations for economic theory. Well, in this topic, we're going to keep our focus on policy failures, on inefficiencies that are caused by the government, but we're going to shift it over away from what happens if we're not at competitive equilibrium, but instead, what happens if the competitive equilibrium is itself made inefficient through a distortion of the supply or demand curve. Something has been done to move the supply or demand curve away from where it should be, thus resulting in a market that no longer operates properly. A market where the incentives have been made toxic. And the main way that we're going to address this is through taxes and subsidies. These are certainly not the only ways that a government can exert influence over people's decisions, but this is one of the main tools that they have. And so we will get into that. Now, in the last presentation, we saw how price controls redistributed wealth, either from the consumer to the producer or vice versa. And we also saw how they destroyed wealth. They redistributed by taking away from somebody and giving to somebody else, and they destroy by disincentivizing productive work, by disincentivizing trade, production, commerce. And we also saw how deviating away from the competitive equilibrium causes an inefficient outcome. And so now we're going to see how taxes and subsidies do the same by distorting the equilibrium. Now, as a quick reminder, recall that supply graphs quantity supplied at each price, and demand graphs quantity demanded at each price. And the price is that which the consumer gives to the producer. There are other costs you may associate with a particular decision, a particular purchasing decision. Back when we talked about the Jevons paradox and elasticity videos, that dealt with additional costs beyond just the mere purchase. But when we graph supply and demand together at the same time, because they both have to share that same vertical axis, we need the price to be defined the same for both of them. And a particular phrase that I'm going to use to clarify this is I'm going to call it the sticker price. Why sticker price? Well, that would be the price on a box in the store. It would be the price on the tag on a piece of clothing. That's the price that is quoted to you before any taxes. Now, what a tax or a subsidy, an anti-tax, a payment from the government to the individual for purchasing something, does is it adds an additional benefit or cost separate from the sticker price. Now, if the consumer were taxed, then that would be a cost added to them. There was a certain level of benefits that they once got from owning the thing, but now those benefits are reduced because they have to give up the money that they, you know, pay towards the tax. And since this reduces their benefits, you can think of the tax as acting like a negative demand shock. And here I have this demonstrated with a graph. I just realized. So you might be wondering, why is it pivoting inwards? Why is the curve kind of swung instead of shifting? I'm assuming throughout this lecture that the tax takes the form of a percentage. So it's not that you're paying a certain number of cents per every unit, but rather you're paying a certain percentage towards the price. Like, for example, in South Carolina, your tax is 7% on durable goods, 1% on food. How big the tax is depends on the price of the good itself. But yeah, with even so, you can see that this is a negative demand shock. It's just how negative it is depends on the price level that you're at. Now, if the producer is taxed, well, the supply curve is a curve of costs, marginal costs. And their cost now is going to be the old cost plus the tax they have to pay. So an increase in cost for a producer is going to be like a negative supply shock. And likewise, you can see that here too. Now, in both cases, as a negative shock, it will cause the quantity traded to fall, and it will cause a deadweight loss to result because the quantity falls. We don't generally consider shocks as causing deadweight loss because shocks reflect real changes in the benefits and costs. However, in this case, the shock triggered by the tax is completely artificial and it is temporary. It only exists for as long as the tax itself is in effect. You could take the tax away and it would return to the old level. So I use this language of shocks in order to try to make it a little easier to understand. You already know your supply and demand shocks, and so you can fit that into this framework. But understand that we are going to be comparing efficiency and the surplus distribution to the old equilibrium and not to the new one. Now, we know that the quantity is going down. And that's common sense, right? If I tax you for doing something, you're going to do less of it. But what happens to the sticker price? Well, what happens to the sticker price depends on who is being taxed. If you tax the consumer, that's a negative demand shock, and so you would expect the sticker price to be reduced. Imposing a tax, if it's on the consumer, would actually lower the price of the good. And if you were to tax the producer, well, that's a negative supply shock, which would be predicted to increase the sticker price. And in these two graphs, you can see both of these scenarios playing out. In the first scenario, South Carolina imposes a sales tax, or it raises the sales tax to a higher level. And at the new equilibrium, there is a lower price, and there is also a lower quantity. In the scenario where South Carolina instead decides to tax the producer, the price increases and the quantity falls. Now, this is what is meant by passing along a tax. Regardless of who you tax, the price is going to change in a manner that's unfavorable to the other party. Nobody is ever made better off by having to pay a tax. I hope that's obvious, that that's readily apparent. But if you were to levy a tax on a producer, because the producer then cuts back on their supply, because their supply falls, that's going to drive the price up for the consumer as well. The producer loses money because they have to pay the tax, but the consumer is also worse off because they have to pay a higher price due to the reduced supply. And so we say, if you tax production, or if you tax a store, you understand, anytime I say producer, I could be talking about a wholesaler, a retailer, or I could be talking about the original factory, farm, whatever it is. Just whoever is selling the product. When producers are taxed, they pass along some of that tax to you. Even though you may not be the one handing over the cash, you will end up paying more because of this. Likewise, if the government taxes you, as they do with sales tax, because that reduces your demand, because people stop buying as much, that forces stores to lower their prices to compensate. This can be a kind of awkward idea to get your head around, and I'm trying out a new way of explaining it in this topic. So if you have any concerns, feel free to reach out to me. Now, we call the burden of a tax the tax incidence. And moreover, we can demonstrate with the logic of supply and demand that who you tax has no effect on the tax incidence. It is entirely arbitrary whether you levy the tax on the consumer or on the producer, because either way, they'll be equally worse off afterwards. Now, imagine paying taxes in a literal sense. Like, imagine if there were 3 people in a room together, you as a consumer, the producer that you're buying from, and a government tax collector standing between you. Now, you, the consumer, care about how much you have to pay overall, the price and the tax, if you're the one who's paying it. And so we'll introduce a new word to describe this. It will be called the consumer price. The price plus the tax if you're paying the tax. And the producer cares about how much they receive overall. The price minus the tax, or what as a worker you would think of as your take-home pay. And so we'll introduce a new word for this, producer price. And then when the consumer hands the producer money, it is like the government is skimming off it. They might take the money from your hand, take a few bills away for themselves, that's the tax, and then they hand it over. Now, if you are a self-interested consumer, you're not even paying attention to how much the G-man gives the producer. You only care about the size of the bundle that leaves your hand. And if you're a self-interested producer, you don't care how much the consumer is giving up. You're just responding to price signals. You're just paying attention to whether or not they're buying. What you care about is how much enters your hand. But the government, by levying this tax, has wedged those two numbers apart. What leaves the consumer's hand is no longer equal to what enters the producer's hand. So in a world without tax, at equilibrium, the marginal benefits have to equal the marginal costs. At equilibrium, what the consumer offers up is equal to what the producer gives up. And that has to be true, because if it wasn't true, it would not be an equilibrium, because one side would either be producing or purchasing too much, or they would not be producing or purchasing enough. If the marginal benefits didn't equal the marginal costs, you would be in a shortage or a surplus situation, not an equilibrium. But in a world with taxes, this scenario cannot be true. See, if the consumer is paying, then it's the marginal benefits minus taxes that are equal to the marginal costs. And if the producer pays, it's the marginal benefits equal to the marginal cost, but plus taxes. But in either case, we can rearrange the equation to express it as marginal benefits minus marginal costs are equal to the tax. The gap between the consumer's marginal benefit of consumption and the producer's marginal cost of production has to be equal to the size of the tax, because they have to be able to pay the government. There is a certain range. At every level of quantity, there is a certain gains from trade to be made on the marginal unit, but the government is skimming. The government is confiscating part of it. At that reduced level of production, the gap has to be equal to the tax. I apologize right now if you have some trouble reading these PowerPoints. These were designed to be shown on a projector in a lecture hall. Now, since demand slopes down, that'd be our law of demand, and since supply slopes up, that would be our law of supply. And since we know that demand shows marginal benefits and supply shows marginal costs, then that gap between marginal benefits and marginal costs always decreases as we increase quantity up to the point of equilibrium. So you see over here, it's at its maximum at zero quantity, and then it falls, 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 until they're equal, right? And this means that for every gap, there is going to be one and only one quantity that results in a gap of that size. And so for every tax, there is going to be one and only one quantity that the tax could correspond to. And thus, this gets us one unique consumer price and one unique producer price. So in this graph, for example, here it is the consumer who is paying the tax. Down here is the producer price. Up here is the consumer price. In this case, since the consumer is the one paying the tax, the producer's price is equal to the sticker price. The consumer's price is equal to the sticker price plus the tax. Now, regardless of if we tax the consumer or the producer, the consumer price is going to be the same, and the producer price is going to be the same. I know that there aren't any numbers on these graphs, which is intentional. I don't think using numbers would really add anything to your experience, but you can see here, I have drawn them so that the gap is the same size in each case, regardless of if it's supply or demand that's moving. And you can see that at that given quantity, the consumer is paying the same amount in terms of money leaving their hand, and the producer is getting the same amount in terms of money entering their hand. Even though in the first scenario, the producer is paying the tax, and in the second scenario, the consumer is paying the tax. Regardless of who's paying, the price is going to shift up or down to make this be true. And you can see it summarized here in a big chart. You tax the consumer, you get a sort of phantom negative demand shock. The sticker price decreases. If you tax the producer, you get a sort of phantom negative supply shock. The sticker price increases. But the gap between the two is always the same. And that gap, because it occurs at the same quantity, and the original demand and supply haven't moved. I made a small error on this, on one of these graphs. One of them, it should be say old supply, but the curve itself is correct. The price moves by enough in the direction needed for these equalities to hold. And you'll wind up with a relationship, an inequality, that the producer price is less than or equal to the sticker price, which is less than or equal to the consumer price. They can't all be equal to each other unless there is no tax at all. A tax of 0, because the gap would be equal to 0. Now, this is an incredibly powerful result because it shows that who you tax does not matter. Oftentimes, people that do not have an economics background will propose taxing one party or the other out of the mistaken belief that it does determine who ends up suffering more. And usually this means that they're going to want to tax sellers of goods and employers, because at least in a modern democracy where, you know, a majority of people are lower class workers, they're not businessmen themselves, the natural pressures on the government to implement more populist measures. Well, this shows us it's not going to work. Regardless of if you tax the store or the consumer, regardless of whether you tax the employer or the employee. Either way, the price is going to shift in such a way that they are equally worse off in either scenario. They are not necessarily equally worse off compared to each other, but it's compared to their outcome in the other scenario of who got taxed. They'll be equally affected. Because of this, you can tax whoever the state finds more convenient or efficient to tax. And usually what happens is the consumer is going to be taxed. That kind of makes it more transparent when you, it makes it less transparent in the sense that when you're shopping, you can get kind of surprised at the end. They ring you up and, the sum is always greater than whatever the sticker said. You understand it's going to be because, there is sales tax. But what this does do is it does make it immediately obvious that the government is taking money from you. I believe that's probably the main motivation why they tax consumers. It's to make it more honest, more clear. However, they collect the money from the producer. So in a store, they don't hand you a bill and ask you to go to the IRS and pay the bill. Right. They take all the money and then they turn over their receipts and they turn over, the share of it that would go to the IRS. So, how do taxes affect well-being? Well, the tax, as established, decreases the quantity traded, and it increases the consumer price, which is bad for consumers, right? Higher prices are bad for consumers. And it decreases the producer price, which is bad for producers. Producers do not like lower prices. But the government gets the tax. So here you see if you're a consumer, it's like your price is up. If you're a producer, it's like your price is down and the quantity is down. Now, since both consumers and producers are getting less pay and less trade, with the consumer by less pay, what I mean is they're getting less benefits from purchasing. Consumer surplus is going to fall, and producer surplus is also going to fall. Now, for the government, raising a tax faces a trade-off. If they raise taxes, they get a higher tax. They get more tax revenues per unit sold, but they also have less sales to tax. The government essentially faces the same problem that a seller of that the producer faces. I was going to say a seller of a necessity. You recall there was this idea that if you sell luxuries, you would like to reduce the price. If you sell necessities, you would like to raise it. And this implies that there's going to be a tax rate in between that maximizes government revenue. And I call this a Laffer rate. That's the phrase I made up myself. There is a concept in economics called a Laffer curve. Basically, it's a graph that on the horizontal axis, you have the tax rate, and on the vertical axis, you have tax revenues. So you see that it goes up and then it starts to go down. Well, the tax rate that maximizes revenues, let's call that a Laffer rate. But I think you can see here, if there was, like I said, if there was no tax, the government would be getting nothing. And if the tax was super high, consumers wouldn't want to buy anything. So, or if they were taxing producers, producers wouldn't want to sell anything. So in either extreme, you don't have tax revenues, but in a moderate situation, you still have sales, so you still have revenues. So we can interpret from that that there would be an optimal level. On the graph over here, you see that in the original market, the consumer would be getting A, B, and C, while the producer would be getting D, E, and F. However, once the tax is implemented, the consumer only gets A. The consumer loses C because that trade isn't taking place, and they lose B because they're paying higher prices. They're not as well off. Their savings are lower because of the tax. For the producer, they lose E. They don't get to make profits off of trade that doesn't happen, and they also lose D for the same reason. Their price is worse. Their economic profits have fallen. What does the government get? Well, the government gets B and D. The length of it is the quantity, and the width of it is the tax. And it's a rectangle. So length times width, quantity times tax per unit. That's total tax revenues. We often like to call this a tax wedge because of that. It's like the government wedges its way in to steal a big chunk. I keep using that word steal. This is literally the model we would use to model theft and other kinds of crime. That's treated like a tax where you may not be guaranteed to have to pay, but on average, you expect to have a certain amount of product stolen from you. So you have to buy more of the product to get the same amount on average. That's normal. We literally use tax models and crime models in the same way. Now, what's going to determine the tax incidence? Well, the short answer is elasticity. So firstly, the more elastic a party is, the more their quantity changes in response to a change in the price. And so if both parties are elastic, if both parties have this kind of play, this ability to stretch their behavior, then the quantity reduction is going to be larger, and the deadweight loss is also going to be larger. So the more elastic demand and supply are, the worse the deadweight loss is going to be. The more total surplus is going to fall, the more destructive the tax is. Because again, the tax is destructive because it disincentivizes productive work. I might have forgotten to clarify, we count the government revenues as being part of total surplus too. That is a gain from trade. They're taking it from the consumer and producer, but at least somebody is benefiting from that. But that gray area, C and E, nobody benefits from that. And you see here, in these three charts, I show different scenarios, making the supply move from more inelastic to more elastic. Well, in the basic scenario, gasoline's pretty inelastic, right? For the consumer, it's a necessity. You need it. For the gas company, they can't really change the quantity all that much. You have to prospect for it. It's I wouldn't exactly say it's rare, but they can't just go out and will more oil deposits into existence. So they're both fairly inelastic. And as a consequence, you get a bit of a deadweight loss. You get a bit of quantity reduction. If you raise gas taxes, people drive less. Oil companies pump less. But it's not a huge deal. if you tax something that is perfectly inelastic, like land. Oh, well, we're going to come back to that later in the video, but let's suppose that land is perfectly inelastic for the moment. Literal land, not buildings on land. You can't just go out and make more of it. In this case, you'll notice that the quantity doesn't fall at all. And so there is no inefficiency. You could crank up the tax as much as you want. And in a case where there's a very elastic supply, like say medicine, the quantity reduction is actually quite steep. It falls by quite a bit. And so it's more destructive as a consequence. Most medicines are very cheap to produce. These pills, most of the cost of it is in research, but the actual variable cost, the cost of literally just making a pill after it's been invented, you're often talking about pennies for a pill that they'll sell for, hundreds of dollars. Things like AIDS medicine used to be extremely expensive. For the company, for the consumer, the demand for pharmaceuticals is very inelastic. For the producer, it's very elastic. It's almost effortless for them to just expand or step up a production line to just churn out more pills. And it's likewise almost effortless for them to just run less bottles on the pill line. It's all chemicals coming out of the lab. Medicines are not made of rare plants anymore. Now, another thing we can interpret from what we know about elasticity is the more inelastic a curve is, the steeper it is. Meaning that for a given change in the price, you're going to get a much greater change in the quantity, and vice versa. So more of the gap is going to fall on the inelastic party's side, and the price change is more weighted against them. So what's the intuition behind this? Well, if you're relatively inelastic, then you don't have as many substitutes. If we're talking about a consumer, you don't have as many substitute goods that can perform the same function. And if we're talking about a producer, you don't have as many alternative lines of work that you could do, or your production lines are more costly to adjust. But in either case, you can simplify it all down to this idea that you don't have valid alternatives. And because of that, you're desperate. You have to have the thing. Now, you could have a scenario where both sides are inelastic, both sides are desperate, and so they both have to come to an agreement. But another scenario that could result is that you could have some lopsided relationship. You could have a producer who is stuck with a certain line of work, and they can't really change their job easily, but their customers can easily walk away. And so that producer is going to be far more desperate for the sale than the consumer is for the purchase. And likewise, you can have a scenario where the consumer is desperate for the purchase, but the producer doesn't really care and can walk away, because the producer can change their line of work, whereas the consumer cannot just buy something else. Well, the side that is relatively more desperate is in a worse bargaining position. And so they're going to end up having more of the tax passed along to them. It's almost as though This isn't literally how it works, but you can imagine it like this. In that scenario where the consumer and producer are passing money between them and the government's skimming off of it, it's almost like they're trying to split a bill at a restaurant. And they're arguing with each other about how they're going to split the bill. Now, in your three scenarios, you see this, playing itself out. In the gasoline case, they're both fairly inelastic. And the bill gets split more or less evenly. It's not completely even in this case. I drew supply being a little more inelastic, so the producer price fell by more than the consumer price went up. If the elasticities were equal, then it would be like a 50-50 split. But neither side is getting especially hurt by it. In the tax on land, well, it's perfectly inelastic. The producer cannot change the quantity supplied. There's a certain amount of land in the world. It can't be helped. And so, since they have to rent out property or sell property, there's no other use to it. This scenario supposes that the producer does not have a use for it if they don't sell it, right? If they had a private use for it, then it wouldn't be inelastic anymore. Well, because they have to make the sale, they end up eating the entire tax. If the producer was the one paying the tax, they would just have to pay the whole tax. They couldn't pass along any of it. And if the consumer was the one paying the tax, they would pass along the whole tax. Because any producer that refuses to accept it, refuses to accept the price reduction, doesn't get a sale. All of his competitors outbid him. So in this perfectly inelastic supply scenario, there's no deadweight loss, but also all of the tax is paid by the producer. And then finally, in the medicine scenario, well, the producer, they're very ambivalent about production. It's very easy for them to just make more or less pills in response to a price change. But the consumer is not ambivalent. They need the medicine. Now, depending on what kind of medicine we're talking about, they might still have some control over this. They could make changes in their own personal life to make certain types of illness less likely. Or we might be comparing different brands. This could be a question of getting the generic version versus the brand name. But either way, I think you would generally agree that the consumer is a little more needy here than the pharmaceutical company is. So if you put a tax on the producer, what are they going to do? They're going to pass most of that tax along. You understand why it's important to get this concept that who you tax doesn't matter. See, I could easily imagine some demagogue going after the pharmaceutical companies saying, oh, it's wrong that they make all these billions of dollars in profit and rah, 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 rah. And they might be right? They might have a point about, for example, price gouging with patents. But if you were to put a huge tax on the pharmaceutical company, the customers are not going to be better off. You would have to have some other way of going after them because they're just going to pass along most of the bill. And if you were to use a price ceiling, then you're still going to get the same result. You're still going to get a big reduction in quantity. Either way, the consumer's screwed. That's the big thing. You can't rig this in favor of one side just by changing who you give the bill to. So in summary, the more elastic supply is relative to demand, the more consumers will pay. That's one way you can formulate it. If you reverse it, if demand is more elastic, then producers will pay more. And the more elastic both curves together are, the worse the deadweight loss is going to be. And these observations, even this very simple framework, carries many important implications for government policy. You can actually apply this to real world problems. You can think your way through if a given proposal is likely to work. And so in the next video, that's what we're going to do. It's not going to be an exhaustive survey of like all of public finance, but we're going to look at a few specific scenarios that I think are interesting and, for the most part, pretty relevant to life.